So, okay, thanks and welcome everybody. I'm gonna actually sort of repeat the talk that I've done last year, because I've been asked to give more tips, or in any case extend that talk. To be honest, there are not so many news in it. There are some changes due to the new Odoo version, and some other little bits are changed at the end there. So yeah, let's go through it. Well, quickly, who I am. I'm Simone Orsi. I'm 39. I live in Rome, but I'm not from Rome. Italy, Python full stack developer, Odoo developer since quite some time, OCA board member. I'm an open source adept, and I work at Camp to Camp, and you can find me everywhere as CMOC, so feel free to ping me out there after the meeting, after the talk. So, quick disclaimer. This is not a lesson on what is a unit test, integration, or functional test. I assume you know it already, but just briefly, the unit test is just meant to test individual pieces of your application, the smallest function units of your application, whereas integration tests are meant to test integrated behavior and functionalities together, and a functional test is actually testing a slice of the functionality to confirm that everything is working fine and doing the right thing on the functional side. So then I assume you're already familiar with Odoo testing, because I mean, nowadays it's pretty well documented. When I started, there was no documentation at all, but today you can find a lot of documentation on official Odoo docs. And this is only about Python tests. I won't go through testing the UI or the JS framework. And another thing that you will see, well, actually, it's not a disclaimer. This is more a fil rouge of the talk, is that test speed matters, especially in the long term. So, quick panoramic on the test classes that we have in Odoo. So, single transaction case, it's a test case in which all the test methods are run in the same transaction. So the transaction starts on the first test running, and then is rolled back only when the last test in that suite ends. And of course, this is a particular case, and normally you need it only when you really have to test that there is a data integrity inside the same transaction, and maybe you are testing a very complex flow, and you want to make sure that at each step you get you get what you expect, and at the same time you still want to split the test into several area of competence, also to keep the test class much more readable and understandable. Then we have a transaction case, which actually, and this is one of the news for version 15, is going to replace save point case, which has been deprecated in version 15. Now, quick note about this. I hate this change, especially because we moved a lot of tests in the OCA to save point case. So, and this is actually included in the migration guidelines to upgrade to version 15. So we will have to change this. And to me, it makes no sense to have something called transaction case if actually it's a save point case. Rant closed. So then we have the HttpCase, which finally has setup class, because now it's based on the new transaction case, which finally offers, behaves like a save point case. So this means that the HTTP test case will be faster. because then you can put all the setup of your test inside setup class. So it's going to run only when the test class is initialized. I think we have an issue with a microphone there. Don't know who is it. Daniel, Graham, I don't know. Okay. So yeah, HttpCase is going to run better, and you will have to move your test setup to a setup class from the setup method. So there you go. Then I won't recommend anymore to use SafePoint case, but just to stick with transaction case. And this is suitable for the majority of our test cases. You can use it always if no special setup is required. And the good thing is that, as I mentioned, for the evolution of the HTTP case, when you use setup class, you run the setup code only once and not for each and every test. And this, of course, ensures that we run the test with a quite good speed compared to the old way transaction case was used to work. This is a special recommendation, and actually, I failed to follow the suggestion from Jairo last year. He told me, yeah, you should propose this to the Odoo master. I didn't, and it's still there. So yeah, I will try to do it this year. But anyway, the point is, you should always disable tracking in your tests. And the reason is you don't need tracking. And as you know, this is a cool feature in Odoo that allows you to have, tracking on field changes on partners and stuff like that. And it turns out that you normally in tests, you play a lot with partners, with sale orders, or any kind of order, any kind of model or record that has tracking enabled. And unless you really need to test some specific behavior of the tracking, like, I don't know, you overridden the tracking, or you are in adding some tracking type, and you want to make sure that a message has been posted and stuff like that. Well, in that case, just, yeah, do not disable it and test it. But otherwise, in all the other cases, which is basically 95 or even more % of the cases, you should disable it. And this is going, again, to boost your test speed. And you can imagine the impact of this into the OCA ecosystem, whereas we have like hundreds of repository and hundreds of builds and test suites running every single day. So this helps us reducing the load of each test suite running. Another thing that to me should be done by default, but is not, is that very often we create users, special users for our test. When we do so, we're not actually just creating the record, we are creating also tracking records, and we are sending out, well, generating an email to reset the password and sending out that email. Well, the email is not going out anymore, finally, but we are still generating and calling on the machinery for the reset of the password. So better if we include in our context another key, which is no reset password. And this, again, will help to make your test run much faster than before when you are creating users. So if you combine this with the old approach of having all the setup of the test in the setup method and not in the setup class. So if you combine that, setup runs on each and every test, and then on each and every test, you're maybe generating and regenerating records that have tracking enabled and or creating users, so calling the machinery for reset password. You can imagine the impact of these little changes on the performance on the test. Another important thing to consider is that we should not use res.config.settings. So res.config.settings is just an hack done by Odoo for providing a unified interface for the settings. And the trick is just that you have one single model, so you can then you can register all the settings view that you are familiar with, and then the res.config settings model is just a proxy to the real models or the real action that are going to happen when you do something with res.config settings. And this makes it very heavy when you call execute, because execute is going to do a lot of things, okay, which you don't need for your test setup. So unless you have to install modules, which you shouldn't do anyway, because it's better to do them to install them explicitly in your test setup, don't do it. Don't use it. So if you have to set company fields, groups, default parameters, do it directly. Okay, you need a company field, just get the current company dot field name and set it, or write whatever. Same groups, add the group to the current user of the test. Defaults, same. Okay. Even for IR config parameters, just call the model IR config parameter and set the parameter there. It's also going to be more explicit for the end, well, for another developer to see and understand what you're doing. If you really want to use res.config settings, call set values instead of execute, because execute is also going to reset the environment and is going to maybe to give you some strange and weird errors that are very hard to debug inside a testing environment. Then again, we end up boosting the test speed. And one other recommendation is outside when you're writing a test, especially when you provide migration steps for your module, or for instance, in Cam2Cam, we use Anthem, that is a tool to write scripts for upgrading. Well, don't use it there as well, because again, you're just going to load more stuff than you need. Testing exceptions. This is not about speed, but it's about how should you effectively test exceptions. So I've seen a lot of time, I mean, I've been doing that for years myself, testing exception just by testing that a specific type of exception was arose. Arisen, and that's not enough. That's not enough, because in the piece of code that you are testing, you might have something else that is not being coded by you somewhere else, overriding the same piece of code and triggering an exception for some other reason. Then it means that you are not testing your thing. So to make sure that you actually run the code that you are expecting to run, you have two options. So the official one coming from the unit test, based Python unit test class, is to use assert rises regex, whereas you can use a regular expression to catch that not only the exception is of the right type, but also that the message inside the exception is the right one. There is another trick that I used to use, especially when it was a little bit hard maybe to find the right regular expression, which is just catch the exception object and check that you get the message inside the exception name attribute. Testing permissions. So this is really recommended. A lot of time we just provide permissions like ACL records and record rules. But normally, in most of the cases, what we have in the test suite is running as admin, which is a very special user, as you know. So if you want to make sure that your permission, your record rules are working as you expect, you should take care of it explicitly. So try to never use admin and instead use another user. You can use self.withUser. It's a built-in helper in the base Odoo test class, and it allows you to simply use the username to log in for the current test. And also, in the case you already pre-configured different users with the right permissions, and you want to run the same test, the very same test with different profiles, then you can use this decorator, which is at users. You decorate the method with it, and the method is going to be run twice or thrice, depending on the number of the users that you pass there. In the screenshot, you see how you can test the permission. So, for instance, here I expect that I can create a record with a user that is manager, and then I expect that I check that an exception, an access error is raised when I create using a simple user, which is not the manager, or when I try to delete the same record with a user that should not be allowed to. Another important thing: disable useless logging. So this has three benefits. I forgot to add one here because it's kind of specific to the CI that you have in place, but I'm going to talk to you about this. So the first important point is that you avoid polluting the test logs, which means that when you look at the test logs, you don't care about the fact that some external API has been called, or that the content of a binary file is. You don't care in the test, right? So that's just noise that avoids to really focus on what is important in the test log. Okay, like seeing that the tests are running, or tracking a specific functionality log entry. Okay, so the rest is totally useless. So when you don't need it, like for example, you delete a record, you don't care about the fact that Odoo is telling you that the record has been deleted. You know it, you are doing it explicitly. So what you do is you mute the logger for models.unlink. And then if you check the logs, you will see other logger that are polluting it and sending useless log entries. So that's the way you can mute them up. And then again, it's also about speed, because even if it's small and log entry is going to write something, right, somewhere, so it's still using some little resource that it should not, or that could be avoided. And the third point is that our CI sometimes fails on Travis because of this. Because maybe you have, for instance, you have you're mocking an external call to an external service where you're sending a file and you get a huge binary file inside the response. And imagine that you have VCR by mocking that request, and that is logging the full binary content. That's quite bad, because then when Travis try to parse the logs, if you have several entries like that, is going to fail because the log becomes too long. So definitely disable them when you don't need them. Recommendation: this is probably already well known nowadays because it's also documented there in the official Odoo docs. But it's quite common to see still in the OCA ecosystem tests on changes and particular phone behavior done by calling the onchange method directly. This is kind of let's say suboptimal, because you don't know if all the onchanges that are attached to the model are playing in the same way. So the recommended way is to use Odoo test common form. In that case, you don't have to take care of these collateral behaviors. It's a little bit slower, but it's better to test the feature properly than simply speed it up. One little recommendation regarding this: when you're testing with a form, you're not actually testing the model underneath the form. So imagine that you use the form class to initialize a wizard, and then you expect to be able to call a method on the model itself. Well, you cannot do that, because the object that you have in your hands in that moment is the form and not the underneath model, which is wrapped with the form. So you will have to save, get the record, and then you can call a method on the record. Mocking. So there are some Odoo helpers. The first one is in a transaction case, and it's .patch. This allows you to patch an existing model class. So in the description, you see how you could do that. And this is actually an excerpt from the base test class in Odoo, which by default is mocking the get gravatar image on the partner, because you don't want to call the gravatar service when you run tests. And this is the way you can do it. So when you do this, so basically you get automatically an automatic cleanup of the patch when the tear down when the test ends, which is going to run in the tear down. And this is sort of not of explicit patching from my point of view, but yeah, it's up to you. If you prefer, you can use this, or you can use a more well-known approach in the Python community, which is using the built-in mock library. It's explicit. You also have a context manager. You can decorate the method, and with the decorator, you can also patch several things at a time. And the object that you're patching, they're going to be passed as arguments to the test method, and definitely more powerful, because you can do several things. Like in this case, for instance, I'm testing that a call to an SFTP service is working. In the end, I don't care about the fact that Paramico is doing what it's supposed to do. I care that I call Paramico in the right way, because I'm just testing the API of the storage backend. So in this case, you see how I can easily patch the class of the storage backend to make it return a file, for instance, in this case, and by simply do mock a dot return value, you simply state that that's the value that should get back, and it simulates the fact that get bin data gives you back that data, actually. And another thing is that you can test if the method are called. So as you see on the left on line 58, I'm just explicitly checking that the makeDirs method, which is the one that generates the folder if they're not available, gets called. So recommendation is go for the built-in library. You can also raise special exception using the sign effect, so it's really very effective. Quickly mocking that time. Actually, this one is in core since in Odoo core since version 14, so no more battle for adding more dependencies in our CI. It's really handy because it's going to freeze the time everywhere across the application. There are some, of course, there are some workarounds, like you import a time library or you patch it, or you import a datetime library and you patch it. But this one is actually well written and is going to patch it everywhere, so you don't have to, you avoid certain weird behaviors caused by other places in the code that are not patched properly. especially if you're using additional Python library.
Careful though, it does not patch PostgreSQL's now function.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
been
Yeah.
there,
Exactly.
been bitten.
Yeah. Normally, well, I forgot to add the note here because when I need that, actually, I just I issue in SQL to write there or patch the SQL thing separately. Yeah. But you're right. Good recommendation. Um, Another point is how to mock request. If you ever try to run a test on, for instance, a function of the website or a web function in Python code or a controller, for instance, well, you always normally the first time you always end up with request unbound error because there is no request, because the issue is that when you run the test with outside of HttpCase, you don't have any real request going on, so the global request is not available. And you can work around this by using the mock request object. Unfortunately, it stays in the website module, but yeah, I mean, you don't have to depend on it, you just import it. And the drawback is that it has limited override. So if you want to hack the headers or other PCs, you have to wrap it in a way that you see here. So you use it as a context manager, and then you add your you inject your attributes before running your code. Test tags super quickly because they are documented. So you can use tag to classify your test, and then when you run the test, you can simply select the tags. Let's say a subset of the test suite that you want to run. One thing that is probably not well known, but it's in the documentation, is that you get automatic tags like post-install and let-install, so you don't need to use them unless you want to remove them. And also you get tags with module names. So you can finally run the test on a module without having to install in it. It's just passing it as a tag. HttpCase, avoid it when possible because it's slow, and unless you really need to test the routing, don't use it. Normally what I do, but this is just me, so you're free to do as you like. Normally I do one unit test for testing the controller method specifically, and I add HTTP test case only for testing that the routing is working as I expect. And by the way, this doesn't work yet with PyTest. Running the test super quickly. I'm running out of time. So standard Odoo, that's it, and you should be familiar with that. And PyTest, if you're not familiar with it, it's very handy because tests run a little bit faster, and you get some additional goodies like selecting specific test and test method in a more Pythonic way, I'd say. Very recommended. I always use it in my daily job. And I want to conclude with this is actually you're going to have a talk by Stefan Bidul about using pip for your setup. Here, I want just to give you a quick picture on how I do that to quickly develop an add-on or test a feature and maybe just run the test. So here I use pip. The precondition is that, of course, you have Postgres installed in your system, and then you can simply run the installation of Odoo, either from a local path, like in the first line that you see there, and you install the requirements. And then what you have to do is either you install the module from the local path using the setup folder that we have in every repo, or you use pip install Odoo add-on and the name of the add-on, and then it's going to come directly from PyPy. The good thing is that you won't have to take care of any dependency because using pip install is going to fetch all the other dependency of the modules from PyPy. And another good thing is that you don't have to take care of launching the Odoo instance passing the add-on path, because when you use that, it's going to be placed automatically in the Python path. And I think that's all. So Alex, I'm open for questions. We have links to the resources here, and thanks everybody. If you have any questions, I'm all here. even if the time is running out.
Well, just next is normally a break, so I think we can take 5 minutes
Okay.
for
Yeah.
for questions. So Robin was asking about the name of the exception being translated or not. So that was a question related to your assert raises regex, I guess.
Yeah.
Unless
Well,
I'm mistaken, it's the string. The name is actually the string passed to the constructor of the regular of the exception.
yeah. Yeah.
So if you don't use the underscore function, you don't have an issue here.
Yep.
Okay, then you have myself asking, I didn't know about the @user decorator. Do you know when it was introduced?
I think it was there already since version at least 14 or 13.
Okay.
Let me get back to that. Test permissions. This one, you mean users?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really depends if you want to test the very same thing with different users, or if you really want to create different scenario for each users. But it's handy because, yeah, it just allows you to use the same piece of code.
That's cool. Regarding decorators, you didn't mention the main use of post-install, which can solve some test failures because you get a database which has, for instance, constraint about required fields, but the module which sets the default value is not yet initialized.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a very common use of post-installed and disable @install for the tests.
Yeah, exactly.
Then we have Yannick saying the form class checks for the presence of fields available in the UI. So you get an error if the field is not visible or editable. Yep. Kirill is asking for tips for writing tests faster.
It really depends. It depends on if the question is how do I learn to code the tests, and my answer to that would be look at the existing code, and possibly not at the Odoo core. Look at the OCA. We have tons of repository and tons of module with good test coverage, and in there you can learn way more than looking at anywhere else, especially if you are talking about tests for Odoo.
One of the things I often struggle with when reviewing code is inheritance of base test classes from, I don't know, sales stock or things like that, which bring tons of stuff, which you don't really, well, first, it brings stuff that you don't need in your test. And you don't know what the real setup is because they often have very poor names in the attributes of the class. And I have one colleague who complained this morning about tests with self.product1 and self.product2, which I agree are terrible names. So try to help people reviewing your code by using meaningful names. I think we all agree about that.
Yeah, there is actually one note regarding this, which is sometimes you really don't have time to do it again from scratch. So even if I hate loading the setup for stock or sales, I really hate it. But I mean, it's going to require too much time to replicate the same thing. And then getting back to the question that we had before, how do I code fast the test? Well, that's a way. On the other hand,
if they are moved to a setup class, that's already good because they used to be in transaction cases.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's going to change with Odoo 15 because it's going to be fine in terms of performance. In terms of what the heck is this variable, then, I mean, even if the variable name is not good, at least you can provide a comment on top of it as soon as you use it, for instance, or just write.
Or make an alias.
Or make an alias, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I agree.
Okay. Daniel is asking if it's legit to reuse demo data for test setup.
Allora, no. To me, it depends. I mean, if the demo data is yours, then it's okay. If the demo data is, I want to use a partner somewhere, I think it's still fine. If you base it on complex setup, like, I don't know, you want to use a demo data from sales, like a sale order, don't do that. I mean, of course, Pedro probably is going to argue the contrary, like never use that. But to me, I mean, if it's your module, then you have total control on it, and you gain one benefit, which is you don't recreate it every time you run the test. On the other hand, you have to be careful when you run tests, for instance, with PyTest. And since, I mean, you're not upgrading the module, it means that if you change something in the demo data, you're going to bump your head against it until you understand that, oh, you have to update the module.
Okay, Yannick is asking actually a good question. How are defined login 1 and login 2 in the @users decorator?
You mean, sorry, this one here, login 1, login 2, is just a string. You pass the string in the decorator.
Okay, and that's the login of
the username, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Is it possible to override the test case from core module into custom modules?
Yes, you can. Well, it depends on what you mean in override. There is one thing to consider, is that if you inherit the full test class, you're going to run them twice. Because your class is going to inherit even the public method, the test underscore something, and then you're going to run all the tests twice. For instance, I use this approach to provide a base for testing permission, for instance, because I know, for instance, that I want to test always that a certain user can read and write or create or cannot unlink and stuff like that. So I define a base test class with public methods, and then I inherit from there, and I just override the model that is used in an helper method. In that case, it's fine. If you want to use existing test class in Odoo core, well, better you ask for splitting, or keep in mind that you're going to run them all twice.
Okay, final question, but maybe this is something which will need to be discussed more in depth in Discord, because it's a specific question from Damien Coupé, who says, I use PyTest to run my test, and when I call a method with super in an inherited model, PyTest will call it twice. Any tip to avoid that? I've never seen this behavior on version 12. Unless you have an issue in your code with the super redefining self with a different environment.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, there is no black magic here, because PyTest is going to run Odoo in basically the same way, just loading the configuration and initialize the server. So never heard about that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was a very nice talk, Simone.
You're welcome. Thanks for the questions.
I learned a few things on my way, which is always nice.